At Prescott's annual gala, Ethan Walker lingered along the back wall, wearing a suit that cost less than most guests' ties. Across the room, Victoria Sterling, a rising businesswoman famous for her cutting remarks and even sharper heels, noticed him immediately. Turning to her circle, she said loudly enough for him to hear, "Who invited someone like that?" A few people snickered. Ethan was already considering a quiet exit when CEO James Prescott stepped onto the stage and asked a question that instantly silenced the hall. "Does anyone here play the piano?" Every gaze shifted toward Ethan. But the story starts earlier, before the gala, before the piano, before the moment that changed everything. Ethan had worked at Prescott Industries for 6 years, buried in the fourth-floor logistics division, the kind of department no one remembered unless something broke, late shipments, system crashes, vendor disputes nobody else wanted. He handled all of it without complaint. He arrived first, left last, and spoke only when necessary. Most executives didn't know his name, some had never seen his face. In a company obsessed with visibility, he existed in near-total obscurity. He was also a single father. His daughter Lily, 7, shared his quiet watchfulness and was the reason he kept returning to a job that treated him like background scenery. Each night he sat beside her bed and hummed a melody his mother used to play on an old upright piano in their Ohio living room. Lily would close her eyes and whisper, "Play it for real someday, Dad." He always smiled and stayed silent. That piano was gone. That home was gone. At the gala, guests in tailored suits and designer gowns streamed through the entrance like water filling a crystal vessel. Chandeliers glittered overhead. A string quartet murmured in a distant corner. Waiters passed with fragile champagne flutes. Ethan took one simply to have something to hold and stood at the edge of the room, studying the rhythm of a world that clearly hadn't been made for him. That was when Victoria saw him. Surrounded by admirers, she surveyed the room like a strategist mapping terrain. Ethan, alone, unsure what to do with his drink, was instantly categorized. Tilting her head with a smile devoid of warmth, she murmured, "Looks like someone from the mailroom wandered in." Her companions turned and chuckled. One man muttered that the doors opened wider every year. Victoria then broke from her group and approached Ethan directly, heels striking the marble floor in sharp, measured beats. "I don't believe we've met," she said smoothly. "Victoria Sterling." "Ethan Walker, Logistics." She repeated the word as if testing its unpleasant taste. Then, turning back toward her circle, she announced loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "Who brings someone like that to an evening like this?" Some people looked away, others stared with polite indifference. Ethan stood motionless, heat creeping up his neck. He set his champagne on a nearby table and glanced toward the exit. 15 steps, maybe 20, and he'd be gone. By Monday he'd be back on the 4th floor, unseen again. Yet he didn't move, not out of defiance, just a quiet refusal to let this be the end of the story. He thought of Lily waiting for him to hum that melody, of the unseen systems he kept running, the problems he solved without thanks. He wasn't nothing, only those who never looked closely believed that. So Ethan remained. He drifted to a quieter corner near the grand piano set on a small platform by the windows. He didn't touch it, he simply stood beside it like someone near an old friend after years apart. His fingers tapped lightly against his glass, marking a rhythm he didn't realize he was keeping. The evening was still young. Speeches hadn't begun. No one in that room had any idea what was about to unfold. For the next hour, Ethan stayed in his corner while the gala swirled around him like a current he wasn't part of. He watched how people gravitated toward their own kind, executives clustering with executives, consultants orbiting potential partners, everyone silently calculating who mattered and who didn't. No one approached him. Even when a server refilled nearby glasses, Ethan was overlooked, as if he were just another fixture in the room. Victoria, however, hadn't forgotten him. She moved through the crowd like someone running a campaign, handshakes, laughter, light touches on influential arms. Yet every few minutes her gaze flicked back toward Ethan's corner, and each time she found a new way to turn him into a punchline. When a venture capitalist asked who else was attending, she gestured casually toward Ethan. "Someone from logistics," she said. "I think they invited the whole building this year." The man glanced over briefly, then returned to his drink. Message delivered. It escalated when a younger associate from her circle approached Ethan with a smirk already forming. "So, logistics," he said, swirling his bourbon. "What's that like, moving boxes?" Ethan met his eyes evenly. "It's making sure everything you rely on actually arrives." The associate blinked, uncertain whether he'd been corrected or dismissed, then drifted away. But the damage lingered. By now several groups had heard some version of the same story. Ethan Walker was a misplaced guest, a bureaucratic mistake wandering through a room where he didn't belong. He felt every glance and whisper. He wasn't numb, each landed, but he had learned long ago how to absorb impact without breaking. That was the lesson of the fourth floor, that was the lesson of raising a child alone. You didn't fall apart because someone laughed, you stayed standing and waited for the moment that counted. That moment arrived just after 9. The quartet's music faded, chandeliers dimmed slightly, and James Prescott stepped onto the small stage. Silver-haired and composed, he carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. He spoke without raising his voice, yet every word drew attention. After thanking guests and summarizing the company's year, his tone softened. He spoke of his late wife, Elena, a gifted pianist before marriage and corporate life overtook everything. Each year at this gala she had played a single piece on the grand piano. Since her death 4 years earlier, the instrument had remained silent. Tonight, he said, he wanted to revive the tradition, not as performance but connection. He looked out over the room. Is there anyone here who plays the piano? Guests shifted, exchanging uneasy smiles. No one volunteered. In a room full of confident professionals, not one wanted to risk imperfection. The silence stretched, 5 seconds then 10, while Prescott waited with quiet hope. Then a voice spoke from near the windows. Douglas, a facilities executive who had been watching Ethan all evening, pointed toward the corner. "There's a man over there," he said. "He's been standing by that piano all night. I saw his fingers moving, like he was playing something in his head." Every head turned. The weight of their attention landed on Ethan at once, heavier than anything Victoria had thrown his way. She recognized the opportunity instantly. Stepping forward with practiced brightness, she said, "Oh, absolutely, let him play. I'm sure we could all use the entertainment." A ripple of expectant laughter passed through the crowd. A few guests already lifted phones, anticipating a spectacle. Ethan stood frozen under their gaze, the room watching him the way a stadium watches someone on a ledge, half horrified, half fascinated. He could refuse, slip away into anonymity, drive home unnoticed. No one would stop him. No one would care by morning. But he could see it in their faces. Walking away would confirm everything they believed. He would be the man who didn't belong and proved it by retreating. He turned toward the piano. Its black surface gleamed under the lights, flawless and imposing, the kind of instrument his mother had never owned. She had played on a battered upright with a chipped middle C and a stubborn pedal, yet treated it like treasure. She had begun teaching him at 5. By 12 he could play Chopin. By 15 he competed regionally. Then illness, debt, and responsibility swallowed music whole. It vanished from his life like a river slipping underground, still flowing but invisible. Ethan stepped forward. Each pace felt longer than the last. Murmurs followed him like wind through grass. He caught Victoria's eager expression, Douglas's faint guilt, and Prescott's steady, attentive gaze, free of judgment or expectation. He reached the bench and sat. His hands hovered above the keys, then settled lightly on them. The ivory felt cool beneath his fingers. He hadn't touched a real piano in 8 years, not since his mother's funeral in a small church in Columbus, where he played the only piece she had ever asked him to memorize, Beethoven, Moonlight Sonata, first movement. She had once told him it sounded like someone who had lost everything yet kept breathing. He hadn't understood then. He did now. He could choose something simple, short, safe, forgettable, earn polite applause and step away. That would be sensible, that would be survival. But he was tired of surviving, tired of shrinking himself, of keeping music locked in the dark. So he let his hands decide. The first notes of Moonlight Sonata drifted into the ballroom like smoke. The room fell silent, not the courteous quiet of waiting but the startled stillness of being caught off guard. The melody moved slowly, aching and deliberate. Ethan played with half-closed eyes, not performing for the audience but speaking through the music, saying what words never had. Each phrase carried weight, each pause felt intentional, silence woven into sound. Years of buried discipline resurfaced in muscle memory, rising like something long submerged. The piece spread through every corner of the hall. A woman near the front set down her glass, hand to her chest. A man mid-conversation stopped speaking entirely. Even the waitstaff froze. Victoria's smile vanished. She stood with her champagne lifted halfway as if she'd forgotten to drink. Her lips parted slightly, eyes fixed on Ethan's hands. For the first time all evening she had nothing to say. When the final note faded, the silence lingered. 1 heartbeat 2 3. Then the room erupted, not with polite clapping but with genuine applause, raw, surprised, and tinged with the uneasy recognition of having been wrong. Prescott was first to stand, applauding steadily at the edge of the stage. Others followed, many looking at Ethan as though seeing him for the first time, because in every meaningful sense they were. Ethan rose from the bench. His hands trembled slightly, not from nerves but from the feeling of opening a door he had kept shut for nearly a decade. He didn't bow or smile, he simply stood, letting the sound wash over him like rain after drought. Then Prescott walked toward him, not toward the microphone or the crowd but directly to him. Leaning close, he said quietly, "Come with me, there's something I'd like to discuss." Ethan followed him through a side door into a private study lined with bookshelves and photographs of a woman at a piano. Prescott closed the door and stood by the window a moment before speaking. "I've hosted this gala for 11 years, he said. "Every time I ask that question, either no one answers or someone plays something empty to impress the room. You didn't, you played because you meant it, that's rare." Ethan said nothing. "I've read your file," Prescott continued. 6 years in logistics, 3 system overhauls that saved this company millions, no complaints, no recognition, no promotion." He regarded Ethan as one might regard something valuable misplaced for too long. "I'm forming a new operational strategy team, small, high-level, reporting directly to me. I need someone who solves problems without needing applause. I think that's you." The floor seemed to shift beneath Ethan, not physically but in the way life tilts when an unseen door opens. This wasn't about the piano. The offer came from 6 years of invisible work finally noticed. The music had simply revealed what spreadsheets could not: discipline, depth, quiet mastery. But accepting meant stepping into visibility, into a world where people like Victoria wouldn't just mock him, they'd compete with him and wait for failure. It meant leaving the safety of obscurity. Ethan glanced at the framed photos of Elena Prescott mid-performance, eyes closed, hands on keys, playing because she meant it. He looked back at Prescott. Rumors began circulating before Ethan even set foot in his new office. By Monday morning, the story had traveled through every level of Prescott Industries, warped and simplified until only the easiest version remained. A single father from logistics played a piece at the CEO's gala, impressed him, and was handed a promotion he hadn't earned. No one mentioned the 6 years of unseen labor. No one spoke of the system overhauls that saved millions. No one noted that Prescott had studied Ethan's record long before he touched the piano. The narrative that survived was the one that made dismissal convenient, a sentimental moment, a lucky break. Ethan felt the shift the moment he entered the 12th floor. The operational strategy suite, glass-walled and close to the executive wing, housed 4 specialists personally selected by Prescott. Their resumes alone could fill binders. They greeted Ethan politely, professionally, and with unmistakable skepticism, as if he were a line that didn't quite belong in the paragraph. Victoria Sterling faced a different problem. The gala had not concluded the way she intended. She had arrived as the sharpest presence in the room and left as the woman who publicly mocked the man the CEO later invited into private conversation. In her world, reputation was currency, and she had just spent a great deal of it. So she adapted. Within days she began revising the narrative. She told colleagues she had always found Ethan intriguing. She mentioned, casually, repeatedly, that she had encouraged him to play, recasting cruelty as support. Whenever the gala arose, she smiled and said, "I'm glad he finally got the recognition he deserved," as if she had championed him all along. The second half of her strategy was subtler. In quiet conversations she ceded doubt. "It's a lovely story," she would say, "but let's see whether he can actually deliver at that level. Being noticed is one thing, sustaining performance is another." She never called him unqualified. She didn't need to. The implication worked for her. Ethan was a feel-good appointment, elevated by a moment rather than merit. Ethan heard the whispers. He understood they wouldn't fade on their own. The only way to quiet a doubtful room was with results too clear to argue with. So he worked it. Within 3 weeks, he identified a long-ignored bottleneck in the company's cross-regional supply chain, an inefficiency draining revenue for over 2 years. Executives had missed it because none had ever worked in logistics. Ethan had lived there. He knew exactly where fractures formed. He drafted a restructuring plan, 47 pages, precise and data-driven, with timelines and projected savings exceeding $2 million annually. He submitted it directly to Prescott without presentation or fanfare, then returned to his desk. Prescott read it that evening. The next morning he convened leadership and projected the proposal without naming its author. He walked them through analysis, recommendations, savings. When finished, he asked, "Who do you think prepared this?" Guesses ranged from finance to outside consultants. None named Ethan. After a pause, Prescott said, "This was written by Ethan Walker. He's been here 6 years. This is the first time most of you have seen his work. That's not his failure, it's ours." There was no applause this time, no spectacle, just a quiet shift. The people who had dismissed Ethan as lucky now faced undeniable proof. The ones who had echoed Victoria's insinuations sat in a room where the CEO had reframed the issue. The company's blindness, not Ethan's ability. Victoria attended that meeting. She sat perfectly poised, expression controlled, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't speak once. Prescott had drawn a clear line between judging substance and judging surface, and everyone knew on which side she had stood at the gala. In the weeks that followed, Ethan's world changed gradually, like a tide turning unnoticed until the shoreline has moved. Colleagues who once ignored him stopped by his desk. Skeptical team members began seeking his input. The strategy group came to see what Prescott had seen. Ethan didn't just solve problems, he saw them before anyone else and addressed them without seeking credit. Eventually, Victoria requested a meeting. They sat across from each other in a 12th-floor conference room. She appeared as polished as ever, yet something beneath the surface had shifted, less certainty perhaps. "I owe you an apology," she said. "What I said at the gala wasn't just rude, it was wrong. I looked at you and decided who you were before you spoke. I'm not proud of that." Ethan studied her carefully. He wasn't measuring sincerity so much as understanding. Anyone could say sorry, not everyone grasped why. "I don't need your apology," he said at last, "but I'll accept it because you need to give it." Her jaw tightened, but she nodded once and left. It wasn't reconciliation or redemption, just acknowledgement of a truth she had tried to avoid. How you treat people who hold no power over you reveals more about character than any deal you close. That evening, Ethan drove home in the same agging sedan, along the same streets to the same apartment. Lily sat on the couch with a book. "How was work today, Dad?" "It was good," he said, sitting beside her. She leaned against him and for a while they were quiet. Then, as always, she asked, "Will you play for me someday, for real?" He looked at his hands, the same hands that had moved across the grand piano at Prescott's estate, that had built systems and held her since birth. "Yeah," he said softly, "I think I will." He no longer needed a ballroom or applause or recognition he never truly wanted. For years he had been measured by the wrong things: his clothes, his car, his floor in the building, his place in a room. None of it had defined who he was. Those who mocked him had learned that lesson painfully. Those who overlooked him were now reading his work. And the man who once stood invisible at the back of a gala now sat beside his daughter exactly where he belonged, not because the world had finally granted permission, but because he had never needed it. The invitation to Prescott's private estate arrived in a cream envelope embossed with the company crest. Ethan turned it over in his hands longer than necessary before opening it. A formal gathering, dinner, drinks, networking, reserved for department heads, senior partners, and those whose names appeared in quarterly reports. At the bottom, in precise lettering, "All employees invited." Technically, that included him. By lunchtime the next day, the invitation had become the break room's main topic. 2 colleagues from supply chain glanced at Ethan while one said, just loud enough, "You're not actually thinking of going, are you?" The other laughed. What would he even talk about, shipping codes? Ethan kept eating without reacting, but something settled inside him. Not pride, fatigue. He was tired of being the person no one expected anything from. Over the next 5 days he prepared. He took out his only suit, a dark navy off-the-rack piece bought years earlier for a job interview. He polished his shoes, pressed a white shirt, and stood before the bathroom mirror the night before the event. The suit was clean and respectable, yet even he could see the difference: the fabric, the cut, the subtle signals of a world he didn't belong to. He told himself it didn't matter. He was going for one reason: to step beyond the 4th floor. On the evening of the gathering, Ethan drove his agging sedan through neighborhoods he had never visited. Houses grew larger, gates taller, streetlights more ornate, until at last he reached the Prescott estate. A valet opened his car door and let his eyes linger for half a second on the vehicle before offering a polite nod. Ethan handed over the keys and walked toward the entrance where guests in tailored suits and designer dresses flowed inside with effortless confidence. The ballroom was vast, all glass and light and quiet wealth. Chandeliers scattered reflections across polished floors. A string quartet played near tall windows overlooking dark gardens. Servers moved silently with trays of champagne. Ethan took a glass and drifted toward the perimeter, observing the same unspoken choreography he had watched at the previous gala, status recognizing status, influence aligning with influence. And once again he did not quite fit. Victoria Sterling noticed him almost immediately. She stood among investors and partners, poised and immaculate, her expression bright with social ease. But when her eyes found Ethan, something unreadable crossed her face: memory, calculation, perhaps regret. For a moment she seemed uncertain whether to approach or pretend not to see him. Ethan saved her the decision by turning away, focusing instead on the room. He was no longer the man frozen at the edge of an event, but neither was he fully comfortable in its center. Visibility was new territory. He could feel eyes on him, some curious, some skeptical, some newly respectful after Prescott's public endorsement. A few colleagues approached cautiously. Conversation was polite, tentative, as if they were still adjusting their understanding of him. Ethan answered simply, without embellishment or self-promotion. He had spent years being overlooked. Sudden attention did not transform him overnight. Later, as dinner concluded and guests dispersed into smaller conversations, Prescott stepped onto a terrace overlooking the gardens. He caught Ethan's eye and gestured him over. "You came," Prescott said, as though noting a quiet milestone. "I said I would," Ethan replied. Prescott studied him a moment. "You're adjusting." "I'm learning," Ethan said. The older man nodded. Visibility is uncomfortable at first, especially when you've spent years proving yourself in silence, but you're where you should be. Ethan looked out across the estate, the lights, the people, the scale of a world that once seemed unreachable. "I'm still the same person," he said. "Good," Prescott answered. "That's why you're here." From across the terrace, Victoria watched them. She approached after Prescott stepped away, her posture composed yet less guarded than before. "You look different," she said. "Same suit," Ethan replied lightly. "That's not what I meant." She hesitated, then added, "You carry yourself differently now." Ethan considered that. "Maybe I stopped trying to be invisible." Victoria gave a small, rueful smile. "I spent years learning how to be seen. I never thought about what it meant to overlook someone." He met her gaze, calm and steady. "Most people don't." They stood a moment in shared quiet, not friends, not adversaries, simply two people aware of a changed equation. Then the music shifted inside, and the crowd began to gather again. Later that night, Ethan drove home along the same streets, past the same lights, back to the same apartment. Lily was asleep on the couch, a book fallen open beside her. He carried her gently to bed and sat for a while in the dim room, listening to her breathing. In the corner stood a small electric keyboard he had bought weeks earlier and hadn't yet touched. He turned it on softly, placed his hands on the keys, and began to play. Not for an audience, not for recognition, just for her and for himself. The melody filled the quiet apartment, simple and real. No chandeliers, no applause, no expectations, only music returning to the life it had always belonged to. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt no distance between who he was and where he stood. Morning arrived without ceremony. Ethan woke before his alarm, as he always had, and moved through the small rituals of his day: coffee brewing, toast in the pan, Lily's lunch packed with careful familiarity. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic outside and the soft clatter of dishes. Nothing in the room suggested that anything in his life had changed. Yet something had. At work the shift was subtle but unmistakable. People greeted him by name now. Not everyone, habits formed over years don't vanish overnight, but enough that the difference registered. A senior analyst stopped by his desk to ask for input on a supply projection. A manager from procurement requested his review of a vendor contract. None of it was dramatic, it was simply inclusion, the quiet acknowledgement of competence. Ethan responded the same way he always had, directly, precisely, without performance. Recognition hadn't altered his approach, it had only altered the room's perception. The operational strategy team had begun to cohere around him as well. At first they had regarded him as Prescott's curious appointment, a variable inserted into a stable equation. But results have gravity. They pull doubt inward until it collapses under its own weight. In meetings, Ethan spoke rarely, but when he did, conversations reoriented. He asked questions others hadn't considered, traced inefficiencies back to root causes, and translated complexity into clear next steps. He didn't claim territory or compete for credit. He simply solved what was in front of him. Over time, the team's skepticism shifted into reliance. One afternoon, after a particularly dense planning session, a colleague lingered as others left. "You know," she said, gathering her notes, "I used to think Prescott brought you in because of the gala." She gave a small, self-conscious shrug. "Now I think the gala just made the rest of us catch up." Ethan inclined his head slightly. "It happens." "What does it?" "People noticing late." She smiled faintly, then left. Not everyone adjusted so easily. In certain corridors the whispers persisted, quieter now, less confident but present. Success that arrives outside expected channels unsettles people. It suggests that the system they trust might not be complete. Ethan understood that. He didn't resent it. He focused instead on the work. Weeks became months. The supply chain restructuring moved from proposal to implementation, then to measurable savings. Additional inefficiencies surfaced and were addressed. Prescott began inviting Ethan to higher-level reviews, not as observer but contributor. The distance between the fourth floor and the executive wing, once immeasurable, collapsed into routine. Yet the center of Ethan's life remained unchanged. Each evening he returned to the same apartment, the same worn couch, the same small kitchen. Lily still asked about his day. He still listened to hers with full attention. And most nights after she slept, he turned on the keyboard in the corner and played, sometimes Beethoven, sometimes fragments of melodies his mother once taught him, sometimes music that had no name at all. The playing grew easier with time. Not technically, he had never lost that, but emotionally. For years the piano had carried memory and grief and absence. Now it carried presence. One Saturday afternoon, Lily padded into the living room while he was practicing. She stood silently beside him for a while, then climbed onto the bench. "Can I try?" she asked. He shifted to make space. "Of course." Her small fingers pressed tentative notes, uneven and bright. She laughed at the sound. Ethan showed her how to place her hands, how to let the keys fall instead of striking them. She imitated him with fierce concentration. "Like this." "Exactly like that," he said. They played together for several minutes, no audience, no expectation, only shared discovery. When she finished, she looked up at him with quiet certainty. "You really do play for real." Ethan felt something settle inside him, deeper than pride. "Yeah," he said softly, "I do." That night after she slept, he sat alone at the keyboard again. The apartment was dim, the city outside reduced to distant murmurs. He began the opening of Moonlight Sonata, the same piece that had once changed the course of his life in a crowded ballroom. But now there was no ballroom. No chandeliers, no scrutiny, no need to prove anything. The music filled only the small room, touching the walls that had always held him, returning to the place it had never truly left. Ethan understood then that nothing essential about him had transformed. The world had shifted around him, recognition granted, status altered, doors opened, but the core remained what it had always been: discipline, patience, quiet mastery, and the capacity to endure without bitterness. He finished the final phrase and let the last note fade into silence. In that stillness, he felt neither invisible nor exposed, only present, exactly where he was meant to be. The following weeks unfolded with the steadiness of a life settling into its rightful shape. Nothing dramatic marked the passage of time, no sudden triumphs, no crises, but a quiet accumulation of moments that, taken together, signaled change more lasting than any single event. At Ashton and Price, Ethan's role had expanded almost without announcement. Invitations arrived in his calendar from departments that had never previously interacted with him: logistics, vendor relations, even finance. He was asked to review projections, to evaluate risk exposure, to advise on operational trade-offs. The pattern was always the same. He listened first, absorbing not only the numbers but the assumptions beneath them. Then he spoke, briefly, precisely, and the conversation shifted course. It wasn't authority he exercised, it was clarity. One afternoon, Prescott stopped by his office, a gesture still unusual enough to register. He closed the door behind him and leaned lightly against the desk. "I've been reviewing the quarterly impact reports," he said. "The restructuring has exceeded every forecast." Ethan nodded once. The teams executed well. Prescott regarded him with the faintest hint of amusement. You continue to redirect credit. It belongs where the work happened. A pause settled between them, not uncomfortable. Finally, Prescott said, "There will be a formal announcement next month. We're creating a permanent strategic operations division. I'd like you to lead it." Ethan did not respond immediately. Not from surprise, he had anticipated the trajectory, but from care. Titles changed responsibilities, responsibilities changed time. Time was the currency he guarded most. What would the scope be, he asked. Cross-functional optimization, process design, long-range planning. You'd report directly to me. Prescott's gaze remained steady. It's effectively an executive role. Ethan considered the implications in silence. The expanded hours, the additional travel, the visibility. Then he thought of evenings at the apartment, of Lily's homework spread across the table, of the small ritual of shared dinners. "I would accept," he said at last, "with one condition." Prescott's brow lifted slightly. "Name it." "My working hours remain bounded. I will not sacrifice evening availability except in true emergencies." The request hung in the air, not defiant but immovable. Prescott studied him for a long moment, then slowly he nodded. "Agreed." They shook hands once, the gesture sealing more than a promotion. It sealed recognition of priorities, success defined not by absorption into work, but by integration with life. When Ethan told Lily that evening, she listened with solemn attention. "So you're the boss now?" she asked. "Not exactly. But you tell people what to do." "Sometimes," he admitted. She considered this gravely. "Okay, but you still come home." He felt the question's weight beneath its simplicity. "Always." She accepted the answer without doubt. Months later, on the day the announcement became public, there was applause in conference rooms and congratulatory messages flooding his inbox. The new division, Strategic Operations, was framed internally as a cornerstone of Ashton and Price's future. Ethan attended the formal introduction, spoke briefly about collaboration and systems thinking, and returned to his office before the reception began. Recognition, he had learned, was loud, fulfillment was quiet. That night he came home at his usual hour. Lily was waiting with a school assignment she wanted help with, a short essay on someone she admired. She pushed the paper toward him. "I wrote about you," she said. He read the careful lines in her uneven handwriting. "My dad works in a big company, but he is still normal. He helps people fix things, he plays piano and teaches me. He always comes back home." Ethan set the paper down, unable for a moment to speak. "You forgot something," he said gently. "What?" "You're the reason I do any of it." She frowned, puzzled. "But I'm just me." "Exactly," he said. Later, after she slept, he sat at the keyboard once more. The melody that emerged was not Beethoven this time, nor any piece he had learned before. It was simpler, warmer, shaped by evenings, by persistence, by the quiet architecture of a life built deliberately rather than dramatically. He played it through then again, refining the phrasing. The notes filled the small apartment, carrying no memory of invisibility, no echo of past dismissal, only presence, continuity, and the certainty of belonging exactly where he stood. Outside, the city moved on in its restless patterns. Inside, the music settled into the walls, into the air, into the steady rhythm of a father and daughter's shared world. And Ethan, once overlooked, once doubted, now simply lived, fully seen, fully grounded, and entirely himself. Years later, the memory of obscurity had softened into something almost abstract, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Ethan no longer moved through rooms anticipating dismissal. He entered them with the same quiet composure he had always possessed, but the world now met him with recognition already in place. The shift was complete enough that he rarely noticed it. Strategic Operations had grown beyond its initial mandate. What began as a small cross-functional unit had evolved into a central nervous system for Ashton and Price's global structure. Processes aligned more fluidly, inefficiencies surfaced and dissolved earlier, decisions traveled faster from insight to action. Ethan led without spectacle. He recruited carefully, favoring curiosity over polish, resilience over ambition. The culture that formed around him mirrored his own, precise, steady, unpretentious. He traveled more than he once had, regional offices, partner sites, occasional international reviews, but always within the boundary he had drawn years before. Flights returned him in time for dinners when possible, for weekends always. Colleagues learned that his calendar closed at certain hours with absolute reliability. It was not inflexibility, it was clarity. At home, time moved differently. Lily grew first into adolescence, then toward the uncertain edge of adulthood. The apartment changed in small increments, textbooks replacing toys, college brochures appearing on the table, music sheets multiplying around the piano. She played now with assurance, her touch distinct from his, lighter, more exploratory, occasionally reckless in a way he had never been. One evening she practiced a Chopin nocturne while he cooked. He paused in the doorway listening. The phrasing was imperfect, the tempo wavering but the emotion unmistakable. When she finished, she turned, catching his expression. "What?" she said, half defensive. "It's yours," he answered. "The piece?" "No, the way you play it." She absorbed that quietly. Praise from him had always been measured, she understood its weight. They sat to dinner together as they had for years. Conversation ranged from her exams to his latest restructuring project in Singapore. Their lives had diverged in scale but not in connection. The ritual remained: shared food, unhurried listening, the ordinary intimacy of continuity. Near the end of her final school year, she brought him an envelope. "Don't open it yet," she said. "I'll tell you when." He placed it on the shelf above the piano without question. Weeks passed. Then, one late afternoon, she burst through the door with breathless certainty. Now. He retrieved the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Acceptance to a conservatory program, piano performance, scholarship included. He read it twice, then looked at her. She stood very still, as though awaiting a verdict rather than celebration. "You chose," he said softly. She nodded. "I wanted to know if I could." "And I can," a small smile appeared. "I think I can." He felt the same deep settling he had known years before when she first placed her hands beside his on the keys. Not pride alone, recognition, continuation. "I'll miss the music in the apartment," he said. "You'll still have yours. It sounds different without you." She stepped forward and embraced him, no longer a child's quick hug but a sustained, equal one. "You taught me," she said into his shoulder. He shook his head slightly. "I showed you where the keys were." The day she left for the conservatory, the apartment grew quiet in a way he had never experienced. Not empty, her presence remained in objects, in habit, in memory, but spatially altered. That evening he sat at the piano and began the melody he had first played the night of his promotion years ago. It unfolded now with new inflection, shaped by absence that was not loss but expansion. He understood as the final notes faded that his life had followed the same pattern as the music he loved. Themes introduced softly, developed through variation, carried forward into new registers without abandoning their origin. Once he had been invisible, then he had been seen. Now he simply was, father, musician, leader, a man whose worth had never depended on audience but had nonetheless found one. In the still apartment, he closed the keyboard and rested his hands on its surface, feeling the quiet resonance beneath. Everything essential remained, and everything essential had moved on exactly as it should. Years continued to pass, but Ethan's life settled into a rhythm that was steady, deliberate, and unmistakably his own. He moved through the corporate world with a calm authority earned through years of invisible labor, but the world no longer ignored him. Recognition was no longer a surprise. It was part of the environment he had quietly shaped around himself. Strategic operations had grown beyond what anyone initially imagined. What began as a small unit reporting directly to Prescott evolved into a central hub for efficiency, problem-solving, and long-term planning across the company. Teams worked with him, not for him, and the culture he fostered reflected his own approach, methodical, thoughtful, and unshowy. Achievement was measured in results, not applause. Travel became routine but never intrusive. Business trips, regional oversight, occasional international projects, all were scheduled to respect the boundaries he had set years before. Even at the height of his influence, Ethan returned home in time for dinner with Lily, for the routines that anchored their lives. At home, the apartment reflected their growing world. Textbooks replaced toys, music sheets multiplied around the piano, and Lily herself became more independent, more expressive. Her playing matured, lighter and freer than his own, full of risks he would never have taken, but always anchored in the discipline he had taught her. One evening, as he cooked and she practiced a Chopin nocturne nearby, he paused, listening. The phrasing was tentative, but the music carried emotion unmistakable. When she finally finished and looked up at him, he said simply, "It's yours." She considered that, smiling faintly. Praise from Ethan was rare and measured, so the weight of those words mattered. Their daily life retained its quiet intimacy. Shared meals, unhurried conversations, the ordinary yet profound rhythms of coexisting with someone you love. They measured time not in promotions or applause, but in presence, an enduring connection that neither accolades nor distance could sever. Years later, when Lily received her acceptance to a prestigious conservatory on scholarship, the apartment once again held a new energy: anticipation, excitement, and the bittersweet edge of independence. Ethan read her letter quietly, absorbing the magnitude of her achievement, and then looked at her. "You chose," he said. "I wanted to know if I could," she replied. "And I can," she said, smiling. The same feeling that had first come over him at the Prescott Gala returned. Recognition, yes, but also continuation. The quiet satisfaction of seeing effort, patience, and guidance bear fruit. The evening she left for the conservatory, the apartment felt empty in a new way. Ethan sat at the piano, revisiting the melody he had first played at the gala, now layered with years of experience, triumph, and love. The notes unfolded differently, shaped by absence and reflection, and he realized that his life, like the music, had moved through variations without losing its core. Once he had been invisible, then he had been recognized. Now he simply existed in full measure, father, musician, strategist, and man at peace with the life he had built. He rested his hands on the keys, listening to the resonance beneath, and for the first time in a long time, he understood that nothing essential had changed, and that everything essential had arrived exactly where it needed to be.